This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, my name is Jo Huckster. I am a assistant professor of environmental studies at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hey guys, I'm Austin Manchadi and I'm a research assistant on this project.
Hi, I'm Joyce. I'm a student at the University of Queensland.
And today, of course, we're continuing our series of videos introducing the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements, and we're on chapter 31, Influence of Environmental Movements on Public Opinion and Attitudes. And we have the author here, Professor Huckster, who's been answering some of our questions. In part two, we're going to start with Austin. You had a really easy, simple question, didn't you?
I'd like to think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but yeah, I do. My big question, it sort of extends beyond the chapter and relates more into some of the stuff discussed in the last chapter. The book talks about the future of environmental movements. But essentially, what I'm curious is, what do you think will happen, say, in the next 10, 20 years, environmental movements-wise, particularly within bringing politics and media and everything? And you mentioned that, people are getting more and more polarized and things just keep moving and developing, sometimes not in the best way. But what do you think will happen, say, in the next 10, 20 years?
I do wish I had a crystal ball and that I could tell you, because I can tell you what I'd like to have happen and the optimistic scenario, but there's also, the much less optimistic scenario about that. So yes, things are quite polarized in many countries, especially Anglo countries in the world right now. And the United States is perhaps the most polarized of them all. And by some measures, we see the United States as being more polarized now than they were during our Civil War. And so that's pretty substantial. And getting past that in many of these places is going to be quite difficult. That being said, I do see some parts of the environmental movement and other movements really starting to focus on the middle. There is a section of the public that in countries like this that are feeling pretty disenfranchised by both sides of the political spectrum, right? Saying like, I feel like I'm pretty moderate, even not necessarily politically, but sort of in terms of socially, like I just don't feel like I need to be extreme at all times. And I think there's a segment of the public that feels that way. And I think that if the environmental movement starts to really try to focus on that segment of the public, that they will be able to get further than continuing to sort of preach to the choir of the furthest left in the US political spectrum, which is what they're currently doing. But it's really difficult, of course, to predict the future. Here in the US, I think that we're seeing a lot of turmoil in both political parties, and that's making it really difficult to decide where we're going to go next. The parties are both sort of struggling with internal issues. That being said, some of our environmental issues are so undeniable now. I mean, we're seeing, there's wildfires across Europe right now, and extreme heat waves in parts of the world that have never seen extreme heat waves. And this is just going to get worse. And so, that's obviously terrible, but you cannot deny that for too terribly long either. We've done a really good job of denying it so far, and we may show that we are capable of continuing to do so, but I would like to hope not. But I find it very difficult to predict where we're going to go. I mean, one would like to think that you just can't get too much further polarized before you would have to spring back towards the middle. And to be fair, historically, whenever we have gotten very polarized, we've had some sort of small rebound. But the last several decades, it's really just been this continuous wedge of polarization. So I'm not sure, but it will be interesting.
Well, here in Australia, we saw the same trajectory of polarization that dramatically and positively changed in the last election. And so, not to take up time with that, but what we saw was that part of the conservative movement broke away and essentially formed a group of related independents that were elected on climate change and other issues because they were just so exasperated by not having action. So I hope it can happen here. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind that.
Yeah.
That would be fine. I don't care who is taking action on climate. I just want them to take action on climate.
That's right. And we have a lot more in common than sometimes we realize. That's what you said. Joyce, you had another question that I think is really important to hear.
Yeah, now that we know how urgent and important the problem is, how can we get more people involved? Because we know that there are different motives and drives for people participating in these activities.
Yeah, that's a great question, Joyce. And I think it ties well into Austin's question and helps me think further about my answer, because one thing that we are noticing is that even though people are more and more polarized on many issues, that at least in the United States, and I assume probably also in Australia, that the young people on climate change are not polarized. The vast majority of the younger generations believe in climate change and believe that we need to take action. That this, I think, is a really positive trend, because the young people are the ones that are taking power now and that will continue to have power in the future. So even if we remain very polarized on many other very important issues, I think that the young people are going to take climate in the right direction. The question is if they can do so quickly enough. So I think that, appealing to one of the ways that we can really make change is by helping young people understand what they can do and what the most powerful things that they can do are. In the chapter, I talk about the issue that we see in the environmental movement, especially in the sort of mainstream modern environmental movement, of placing blame and the need to act on the individual. And many researchers, myself included, find that to be very problematic, because although it is tempting to say, you can make a difference by this one small thing, change your light bulbs. Most people know when they change their light bulb, like, okay, I did it and the climate has not changed. They know pretty quickly that this doesn't feel effective, right? And so it makes them feel ineffective. It makes them feel sort of separated from the problem, like there's nothing I can do. And so I think one thing that we need to be doing in the environmental movement is changing the messaging and helping young people see the things that they can do that are effective. Don't spend all of your time telling people to go vegan and change their light bulbs. Spend time telling people how to organize. How do you get other people involved, and how do you get them to reach out to public officials? How do you get them to organize effective campaigns? If the environmental movement was teaching other people how to, and young people, how to make a movement, rather than telling them to change their lifestyle and, use less plastic, which great, like don't not use less plastic, but that's not what's most effective. What's most effective is getting policies enacted that change the way industry works, the way that our political system works. Those are the things that are going to make the change that we need. So I think we need to be helping young people realize the ways that they are most effective, rather than telling them over and over to do things that they already know don't make a difference. Other segments of the population are really important, and we need different sort of frames or way of talking about issues that appeal to their values. So one thing that the environmental movement, especially early on in the 60s and 70s did, was spent a lot of time talking about conservation. So conservation, saying we need to take these places, these pieces of land, and set them aside away from human use. Early on, that was actually called preservation, and the terms have changed over time, but we now call it conservation. So when you think of a conservation area, it's probably a place where people can go for recreation, but they can't use it to do anything, right? And although that has its value, helping keep ecosystems intact, it has historically left out a number of different communities. So for example, most of the national parks in the United States are often touted as uninhabited land and wilderness, right? But those places actually were inhabited. in the United States, they were inhabited by Native Americans, and we actually kicked them off of their land in order to make wilderness. And so if you want to appeal to marginalized communities, for example, in the United States, telling them about this wilderness, which is a place that's expensive to go to, that used to belong to or be part of Native American culture and has been stripped away from them, is the thing we need to preserve, you're probably alienating that community rather than bringing them on board. And so we need to really be thinking about stuff like environmental justice and ways in which we can make sure that this is an equitable movement that lifts up all different types of people, rather than saying the environment is only for this group of people and the environment is not for this group. The environmental justice movement itself has done a great job of that, and I've talked about it a fair amount in the chapter. I wish I could write a whole second chapter just about what they have done and how the environmental justice movement has changed public opinion, because what it's done really well is make it clear that the environment isn't just ecosystems separate from humans. Humans aren't going away, right? We're not going extinct. We're always going to exist within these ecosystems. So we have to start thinking about the ecosystems that live all around us. We have to start thinking about the health of people and animals and plants and ecosystems that are next door to power plants or plastic manufacturing facilities. We can't just be looking at national parks and saying we have to set aside more land without people, because that's unrealistic and it excludes a large amount of the population.
And even though it's not covered at length in your chapter, Professor Huckster, it's certainly the case that there's some brilliant chapters on that, as Austin and I and others, students and NRAs have been discovering within the handbook. And I guess I echo your point, though, that there's a lot now on what's happening in the climate justice and environmental justice movement, and the missing gap in the literature is what is working, how's it working, for whom is it working, and who is it missing that we need to mobilize in different ways to attract them in. The other point that I resonated to in what you just said is about trying to not just look at individuals, but change policies that affect businesses. And one of the things for me that was very heartening looking at the handbook is realizing how the action in political consumerism and changes of industrial practices does connect in with that mainstream in ways that, you know, many of us aren't aware of and find surprising. So on the one hand, it's true when we change individual behaviors like going vegan or buying free range eggs, that can do nothing. Sometimes that does little to change industrial practices. But what we've seen over time is these tipping points where people start to introduce plant-based diets in the fast food industry. And then that creates an opportunity, a political opportunity, where leaders can regulate in a different way and start to look at maybe down the track, mandating that there always be plant-based opportunities, and then down the track further limiting meat and so on. But the critical issue is around limiting fossil fuels at the moment. And as you know, there's only a tiny number of companies when we look in the vast industrial and ecosystems that are deeply implicated and spending a fortune on politicians for that. So lobbying and organizing and taking advocacy, that's where it's at. I guess I want to come back to, since we've got a few minutes, your Austin's question at the start of, what's going to happen in the next 20 years and how can movements engage? So in that final chapter, the author talks about the tension in movements between a catastrophic pessimism and optimistic hope. So you said at one point just now, humans are here, we're not going extinct. But some people, as you know, Extinction Rebellion is advocating on the basis that we need to take seriously the risk of extinction. Can you comment on that tension? How do you see that in the environmental movement now? And what do you think the advantages and disadvantages of that frame are for influencing the public?
Yeah. One thing that's really interesting about working in environmentalism is seeing things that I deeply agree with and think are really, really important points, but then also working as, the bulk of my research is actually in environmental communication. And seeing the things that are actually effective at moving the public and how those differ from what we might want to say. Yeah. So generally, the most extreme version of whatever message you're trying to get across is not going to be the most effective with the largest segment of the public. So scaring the pants off of people generally is not an effective form of communication. What you tend to get is people emotionally, as psychologists, you all know this, people emotionally shutting down, right? Getting sort of numbed to the message. We get all kinds of doom and gloom messages all the time. And most of us just are trying to get to the end of the day. Did I study for the right exam? Do I have food on the table? And we can't filter all of that terrible doom and gloom all of the time. And so I think that, as admirable as some of these more extreme messages are, that they are not helpful in getting that middle of the public, like the people we need to move, on board. They're just going to make them shut down. And so that's how I feel about, threats that humans will go extinct. However much realism there is there, that's not going to help people get on board. It's going to make them turn away. And that's how I feel about the doom and gloom messaging. Yes, there are absolutely terrible pessimistic possibilities, but there are also optimistic possibilities, and there are lots of middle of the road possibilities. And we don't hear about those in the context of, if we do these things, this is the beautiful future we have to look forward to. Instead, what we're often sold is, this is the terrible thing, turn away from the terrible thing. And what you're telling people is, there's the terrible thing, but here, I'm not telling you what you should turn towards. And I think we need more messages about what we should be turning towards. What's the positive future we want, and how do we get there, rather than this is the scary thing to run away from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the psychological literature totally backs up what you just said. Austin and Joyce, just be warned, because in a moment I'm going to say, what are your final questions for Professor Huckster? So I'll just talk now for about 30 seconds so that you've got time to think of one. But I thought, these are just really validated, including in work here at UQ by Kelly Fielding and Matthew Hornsey and others, in my own work. It's like backlash effects are real in the environment movement. And in fact, in my literature on the effects of movements from a psych perspective, which has been experimental and not looking at these big mass data sets that you highlight in the chapter. Doing nothing is very common, and backlash effects are very common, and moving people in the direction that you wanted was the least common outcome in my research. Austin and Joyce, do you guys have any final questions for Professor Huckster?
I guess, I don't know if this is the right place to ask it, but I think you're probably the best person in the world to answer it. Do you have any advice to keep away from sort of the doom and gloom that you say some people present when they project really extreme stuff? Like being a uni student, obviously on, open days or whatever, when we have there, you see some very, very polarized groups, left and right, but they're like, the world's going to end next year. Like, how do you navigate away from that so you don't get sucked into that and, just think, oh, what's the point of even trying anymore?
Yeah,
great question.
That's such a great question. Yeah, I teach a whole class on that. A climate change communication class at Eckerd. So it takes a semester, but I think that one thing that you can do is start to do some research, start to cultivate for yourself what it is that we should be moving towards. Like I said, what kind of positive future can we see if, for example, we move to only renewable resources? How clean will the air be? How much fitter and happier will we all be from using our cars less? And start talking about, what I'm really envisioning is think about this beautiful future with these really tight-knit communities in which all of our activities involve one another, and we have clean air and renewable resources and equitable jobs, and talking about the thing that you want everyone to move towards, rather than, like I said, the thing you want them to turn away from. And I really, even encourage you to go talk to those doom and gloom folks and say, hey, how's that working for you? It's not going great, right? So maybe we should try a different tactic. That's my challenge to you, Austin.
Well, I look forward to the recording of you doing that, Austin.
Yeah,
bring it on. And what about you, Joyce? Do you have any final reflections or questions for Professor Huckster?
Yeah, so if we just considering global warming and use of fossil fuels, we use it as our main source for energies and materials. So How do you see environmentalists can participate in terms of discovering or replace this like source of energies?
Yeah, so the good news is that we actually have the vast majority of the renewable resource technology that we need. What we need is the political will to go there. So environmental movements, environmental activists, environmental researchers, obviously we need to be looking for better and more efficient ones as we go, but we don't really need to discover any new magical technology. We have everything we need. And there's some really good studies out there and books out there showing, how it is that we would move Australia or the United States over to 100% renewable, especially electricity first. And so I would encourage folks to obviously research some of that, but then those are the messages that I think we need to talk about. Is it's not like we need to do more research. We have the research. What we need to do is get the policies in place to get out to the fossil fuels and bring in the wind and the solar and the geothermal where it's viable.
What a great way to finish. Let's all go and do that now. Okay, I will say thank you to you, Professor Huckster, and thank you to Austin and Joyce for participating in this recording series and today's session. And thank you to our viewers if you're with us to the end. Bye now.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.